Dr. Samuel Machado walked through the hospital corridors with the weight of a lifetime on his back. At 60 years old, his imposing figure contrasted with the tiredness that his expressions could not hide. Known for his surgical precision and almost obsessive perfectionism, Samuel was respected among his colleagues. However, few knew the real man behind the infallible Dr. Mask. Since his wife passed away, Samuel has increasingly isolated himself in the hospital, avoiding the emptiness of the silent house that had once been his home. The clinical environment, with its white walls, sterile smell and the constant sound of medical equipment, was the only place where I could suffocate the ghosts of the past. There, he could focus on his work, on the lives he saved, on the precision of the surgeries he performed. But there was something that morning that was beyond his control. As he reviewed the charts of the day's patients, a name made him stop abruptly. Livia Duarte. The sound of the surname echoed in his mind, tugging at a forgotten string deep in his memory. Duarte, a word that carried with it the weight of another time, another life. The name Livia was unfamiliar, but Duarte carried a story that Samuel believed he had buried. He looked through the file. Livia was 26 years old, and was hospitalized after emergency surgery. Samuel's heart accelerated slightly when he saw the patient's photo in the medical record. There was something about those features, something that sent a chill down his spine. The eyes, the shape of the face, a reflection of someone I had never forgotten, Sofia Duarte. The image of Sofia, his great love from his youth, appeared in his mind like a vision. The two had enjoyed an intense romance, something he never experienced again after she abruptly disappeared from his life. She had been the center of his world, and suddenly, like a whirlwind, she disappeared without explanation. Samuel never knew what happened, and over the years he forced himself to move on, trying to stifle the memories. But now, faced with the name Duarte, the wounds of the past seemed to open up again. With his thoughts confused, Samuel paused before going to Livia's room. He was no longer the same fearless young man he once was. Time and solitude had hardened him, transforming him into a reserved and methodical man. But in that moment, he felt he was about to confront something much bigger than any medical diagnosis. Upon opening the door to Livia's room, Samuel prepared himself to see just one more patient, like so many others. But when his eyes fell on the sleeping girl, he felt a shock of reality so strong that for a moment the air seemed to disappear from his lungs. Livia, she wasn't just similar to Sofia, she looked like a younger version of the woman he loved deeply. His eyes ran over the details. Her jawline, her brown hair that fell softly onto the pillow, even the delicate way she breathed, everything reminded him of Sofia. The visual impact left him paralyzed, as if he were looking at a living memory, materialized there, in the hospital bed. For a moment, he forgot his role as a doctor, dominated by the whirlwind of emotions that now took over his mind. As he watched Livia, flashes of memory began to invade his consciousness. He and Sofia, young, walking through the university park, laughing at silly things, making plans for the future. The gentle breeze that moved her hair, the sound of her laughter, memories that Samuel had repressed for years. He was always methodical, rational, but Sofia had made him feel things he never experienced again. And now, so many years later, the image of Livia made him relive it all. Trying to maintain professional focus, Samuel picked up the medical records next to the bed, trying to find distraction in the medical records. But his eyes could barely stay on the words. When he read Livia's mother's name, Sofia Duarte, his heart stopped for a second. The confirmation he feared and, at the same time, craved. He felt as if the ground had disappeared from beneath his feet. Sofia, the woman he loved so much, was that young woman's mother? Questions began to swirl in his mind. Had Sofia gotten married? Did you have children? And why didn't she ever look for him? Samuel, always so rational, felt internal chaos take over. He knew he needed answers. But how would he face the past that came back to the surface in such a brutal way? His thoughts were interrupted by a subtle movement from Livia, who was beginning to wake up slightly, still under the effects of anesthesia. Samuel took a deep breath and walked away a little, watching her from a distance. I needed to remain calm. But inside, his soul was at war. He knew that this reunion with the past would change everything, but he had no idea how to deal with the emotions that exploded in his chest. There were things he never knew about the end of his story with Sophia. And now, through Livia, he was about to find out. Leaving the room, Samuel walked slowly through the hallways, trying to process the avalanche of memories and questions. The coldness of his carefully constructed life was beginning to shatter. He needed to know the truth. I needed to know what happened to Sophia, and what Livia represented in all of this. Dr. Samuel Machado could barely concentrate after leaving Livia's room. His steps were automatic through the cold and silent corridors of the hospital, but his mind was in a real hurricane. Livia's medical record was still in his hands, and he found himself staring at the name, Sofia Duarte, repeatedly, as if those words could provide answers to the questions that arose in his head. He sat on a bench near the doctor's break room, but the tiredness wasn't just physical. For more than 30 years, he will build his life around control over his emotions, his decisions, and even his relationships. But now, faced with this sudden return of the past, everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. He remembered how Sophia had disappeared from his life so abruptly. There was no formal farewell, no definitive goodbye. One day they were together, making plans for the future, and the next, she was simply gone. Samuel had spent years trying to understand what had happened, why she had left him without explanation. Now, Livia's presence seemed to be a key to all of this, but at the same time it brought back the fear of facing answers that he might not have been prepared to hear. His trembling hands placed the chart on his lap as he ran his hands through his gray hair, in a gesture of exhaustion. The similarity between Livia and Sophia was something he couldn't ignore. The same eyes, the same delicate way of breathing, as if time had placed a younger version of Sophia before him, only to torture him with the memories of what he lost. With a heavy heart, Samuel decided he needed more information. I needed to see Sophia again, to hear from her what really happened. But how would he do this? And did she still remember him the same way? That night, the silence in his home seemed more oppressive than ever. The once comfortable walls now suffocated him, as he moved from side to side of the room, unable to rest. He tried to find some distraction, but everything around him reminded him of Sophia. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, sat down in the worn armchair in the living room and looked at the clock on the wall, whose hands seemed to move slowly, each second seeming like an eternity. The memories invaded his mind with an intensity he hadn't felt in years. Sofia Duarte had been more than a sweetheart, she had been the center of his universe. The way her eyes sparkled when she talked about the dreams they had, the afternoons they would lie on the grass in the university park, discussing the future. The future that never came. Why did she leave? The question resonated in his mind like a distant echo, unable to be answered. He clearly remembered the last day they were together. It was an ordinary afternoon, nothing seemed out of place. They had planned dinner over the weekend and were talking about the next steps in their careers. Then, out of nowhere, she was gone. Samuel looked for Sophia everywhere, called countless times, went to her house, but never got an answer. It was as if she had disappeared from the face of the earth, leaving only a crushing absence in her life. Now, so many years later, discovering that Sophia had had a daughter, Livia, a 26-year-old woman, made the pieces of the puzzle start to fall into place. But there was still a huge void between the memories he had and the reality that Livia now represented. Who was Livia's father? Why didn't Sophia ever tell him anything? And, above all, did Livia know something about that past that he so wanted to forget, but that, at the same time, he longed to confront? Samuel got up from the armchair, walking to the window. He looked up at the night sky, taking a deep breath. He knew he had to act, but fear paralyzed him. What would you do when you finally confront Sophia? Would she recognize him? Would you feel the same as him? Or had her life moved on without even a memory of him? And Livia, what was the role of that young woman who looked so similar to Sophia? The more he thought, the more lost he felt. That night, Samuel couldn't sleep. Sophia's images haunted him, and Livia's reality kept him awake. There was no escaping his restless mind. The past he tried to bury came back with overwhelming force, and he knew that, somehow, he would have to face it. The next day, Samuel returned to the hospital even more restless. A bad night's sleep will leave your mind exhausted, but at the same time, determined. He knew that the meeting with Livia would be inevitable. The question that haunted him now was, as would he handle it? I needed to know more about her, find out what really connected her to Sophia and if it was possible that there was a deeper story between them all. When he arrived at the hospital, he went through his daily tasks almost automatically, his thoughts distant and fixed on Livia. Around noon, I heard that she finally woke up. His stomach dropped when he heard the news. That would be the moment when Samuel and Sophia's worlds began to collide in an irreversible way. He walked towards Livia's room, his steps a little more hesitant than usual. When he opened the door, he found the young woman awake, lying on the bed, still a little pale, but with her eyes alive and alert. There was an air of strength and resilience about her that immediately caught his attention. As soon as she noticed him, she gave him a small, polite smile. "Dr. Machado, right?" Her voice was soft but firm, filled with obvious curiosity. Samuel nodded, approaching with calculated steps, trying to maintain the professional posture he valued so much. He couldn't show the emotional storm that was consuming him inside. Instead, he checked Livia's vital signs, observing how she looked at him intently, as if she sensed there was something more behind her tired eyes. "How are you feeling?" he asked, keeping his tone formal. "Better, considering the situation." "The surgery was successful, right?" she replied, trying to bring lightness to the environment. Samuel nodded once again, but inside, his mind was racing a mile a minute. He struggled to find the right words, the ones that wouldn't sound invasive, but that could get him closer to the answers he was looking for. Livia watched him with an attentive expression, as if she were also trying to decipher something in him. For a few seconds, silence took over the room, and Samuel felt the urgency to break this invisible barrier. There was something he needed to ask, something he couldn't hold inside anymore. "Livia, can I ask a slightly personal question?" His voice sounded low and controlled, but the weight of the question was clear in his tone. She frowned slightly but nodded. "Of course, doctor. What would you like to know?" Samuel hesitated for a moment, his throat dry, as if the words refused to come out. He took a deep breath and finally the question that tormented him escaped his lips. "Your mother. Sofia Duarte, who is she?" The silence that followed seemed deafening. Livia was visibly surprised by the question, clearly not expecting her doctor to ask such a personal question. Your eyes narrowed for a moment, as if you were trying to understand the reason for his curiosity. After a few seconds of tension, she finally responded, with a calm tone of voice. "My mother. Sofia Duarte. She lives in a small town, outside the capital." "Why? Do you know her?" Samuel's heart skipped a beat. Here was the confirmation I had so feared and longed for. Sofia was not only alive, but she will continue her life elsewhere, far from him. His emotions were now a mixture of relief and pain. She had built a family, a life, and he wasn't part of it. The impact of Livia's response left Samuel stunned. The words, "Do you know her?" echoed in his mind as he tried to process the situation. He desperately wanted to ask more questions, find out more about Sophia, but he knew he couldn't run away from the moment. The prolonged silence made the young woman uncomfortable, and she finally broke the mood, raising an eyebrow and giving a small nervous smile. "It seems so," she commented lightly. "You're pale, doctor. Are you sure you're okay?" Samuel forced a smile. As a doctor, he was always good at hiding his feelings, but at that moment, the emotional turmoil was almost impossible to hide. "I knew your mother many years ago," he said finally, choosing his words carefully. "It's been a long time. I didn't know she had a daughter." Livia seemed intrigued by the revelation, but didn't press immediately. She knew there was something unsaid there, but Samuel's careful way of speaking indicated that it was something from the past, something that still weighed on him. "Yes, my mother was always very private about the past," Livia replied, looking away briefly, as if reflecting on her own words. "She never talked much about life before I was born. I always thought it was just a chapter she preferred to leave behind." Livia's words hit Samuel hard. A chapter she would rather leave behind. He now began to understand that Sophia had erased the life they lived together, as if it were a page torn out of a book. But why? What would have happened for Sophia to break so abruptly with the past? And now, after all these years, Samuel needed to confront this truth, even though it was painful. "Maybe, some stories need to be revisited," he said softly, as if he were speaking as much to himself as to her. Livia looked at him curiously, but seemed to respect his space, aware that there was something deeper in those words. Samuel knew the next step was inevitable. He needed to see Sophia again, look into her eyes and finally confront everything that had been left unfinished. Upon leaving Livia's room, Samuel's mind was made up, but the emotional weight pressed on him with every step he took through the hospital corridors. The reunion with Sophia now seemed to be not just a matter of time, but an inevitable necessity so that he could face the past and move forward, or, who knows, start a new phase of his life. 2 days passed since the conversation with Livia, and Dr. Samuel Machado couldn't shake his thoughts about Sophia. Life at the hospital followed its chaotic rhythm, but he was oblivious to the rush around him. Each moment brought him closer to the decision to look for Sophia, to seek the answers that his soul so desperately yearned for. Memories, long buried, now surfaced with overwhelming intensity. At the end of the 3rd day, Samuel decided he could wait no longer. He used the information in Livia's medical record to track Sophia. The address was there, in a small, quiet town just a few hours from the capital. Samuel hesitated for a moment, but he knew this was his only chance to confront a past that had haunted him for so long. The next morning, with his heart racing and his mind flooded with questions, Samuel left the hospital and hit the road. Each mile he covered seemed to bring him closer to an emotional outcome, but it also fueled his fear. What would he say to Sophia? What would she say to him? When he finally arrived in the city, the scenery was simple, with modest houses and quiet streets, completely different from the urban hustle and bustle he knew. Sophia's house was small and cozy, surrounded by a flower garden. As he stopped the car in front, Samuel felt his palms sweat. His fingers hesitated for a moment on the car handle, but he took a deep breath and decided to move on. As I walked to the door, the feeling of déjà vu was overwhelming. The last time they were this close to Sophia was decades ago, when the two still shared dreams of a future together. Now, everything seemed different, but the weight of the past still hung over him. With a light knock on the door, Samuel waited. Time seemed to have slowed down, and every second was an eternity. Finally, the door opened, and there she was, Sophia Duarte. Older, with features marked by time, but still unmistakably the same woman he fell in love with so many years ago. The shock was immediate. Samuel and Sophia stared at each other for a brief moment, as if time had frozen. Neither of them could speak. Sophia seemed paralyzed when she saw him, with her eyes wide and her expression of surprise mixed with confusion. For a moment it was as if all the years of separation hadn't existed, as if the past was being thrown back into his hands. "Samuel." Sophia's voice came out almost like a whisper, hesitant, as if she herself doubted what she saw. Samuel couldn't find the right words. There she was, before him, the woman he had loved and lost without ever understanding why. He watched her closely, noticing the small changes that time had brought. Her hair, now shorter and with gray strands, framed a face that still carried a serene beauty, but there was also a sadness there, as if she also carried the weight of decisions from her past. "Sophia," was all he could say at first, feeling his voice crack. The silence between the two was filled with a mix of emotions. The tension of the reunion, the unresolved memories, and, above all, the weight of what was left unsaid all these years. Samuel could see in Sophia's eyes that she was also struggling to understand what was happening. It was as if the past had inevitably caught up with them, and now they were forced to face all the unresolved issues. Sophia took a step back, as if she needed space to process his presence. She looked at the ground for a moment before turning her eyes to Samuel, visibly moved. What are you doing here?" she asked, her voice trembling. Samuel took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but feeling that anything he said would sound inappropriate. He knew he needed answers, but he also understood that Sophia probably had her own reasons for disappearing. "I found your daughter, Livia, in the hospital," he said, finally, in a low voice. "And when I saw the last name, I knew I needed to see you. There are so many things I need to understand, Sophia. So many questions were left unanswered." Sophia's eyes widened slightly when she heard her daughter's name, but she soon lowered her head, as if gathering strength to face what would come next. "Is Livia okay?" she asked, visibly worried, but with a tone that also indicated that she wanted to change the subject. "Yes, she's recovering," Samuel replied, taking a step towards her, trying to break the distance between them. "But Sophia, why did you leave? What happened to us?" The question, which Samuel had been holding on to for so long, finally came out. It was a mixture of pain, confusion and the need to understand. He needed years to try to overcome the void left by Sophia, but now, face to face, everything came back with overwhelming intensity. Sophia sighed deeply, as if she were carrying an unbearable weight on her shoulders. She looked at Samuel with eyes filled with contained sadness. "I didn't want it to be like this, Samuel," she said, finally. "At the time I did what I thought was right. But looking now, maybe I made a mistake." Samuel frowned. The pain in Sophia's words made him realize that something much bigger had happened. It wasn't just an ordinary separation. There were secrets buried there, something he still didn't understand. "I loved you, Sophia. I would have done anything for us. But you left, without any explanation. I never knew why." His voice sounded firmer now, filled with years of repressed pain. Sophia looked at him with teary eyes, as if she was finally ready to tell the truth. "Because I was pregnant, Samuel," she confessed, her voice breaking. "I was pregnant with Livia." The words fell on Samuel like a blow. He stood frozen, feeling the world spinning around him. "Pregnant? From him? Was Livia your daughter?" All the pieces he couldn't fit together now made brutal sense. The reason Sophia disappeared, the reason she never came back. Everything was clear. Livia was not just any patient. She was his daughter. "Your daughter." Samuel took a step back, as if he needed air. His mind tried to process everything, but the impact was devastating. All these years, he had a daughter and never knew. All this time, he believed that Sophia had simply left him, but there was something much bigger behind it. "Is Livia my daughter?" he asked, almost in disbelief. Sophia nodded, tears finally streaming down her face. "Yes, Samuel. I never told anyone. Not even for Livia. And now, I don't know what to do anymore." The silence that followed Sophia's revelation seemed endless. The words echoed in Samuel's mind as if time had stopped. Livia is my daughter. The weight of those words was unbearable. He looked at Sophia, his eyes filled with a mix of pain, surprise, and deep confusion. It was hard to believe that all these years he had a daughter he never knew about. The emptiness he felt since the end of his relationship with Sophia now made sense in a way he could never imagine. Sophia, on the other hand, seemed somewhat relieved to have finally told the truth, but her eyes still carried the burden of a secret kept for so long. The tears on her face fell slowly as she waited for Samuel's reaction. He had always been so strong, so determined, but now she saw a vulnerable man, someone who had been crushed by something she had hidden for so long. "Samuel," she began, her voice hesitant and full of regret. "I did what I thought was right. At the time, I didn't know how to deal with everything. You were starting your career, full of opportunities, and I was scared." Samuel couldn't believe what he was hearing. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the whirlwind of emotions that consumed him. "She hid it from me for so long," he thought, the weight of anger and sadness pressing down on him. "Did you think hiding from me that I had a daughter was right?" asked Samuel, his voice broken, but with an intensity he couldn't disguise. Sophia quickly wiped away her tears, trying to maintain some dignity in front of him. "I was young, Samuel. I was lost. When I found out I was pregnant, you were already too busy with your conquests. I felt like I had no place in his life. Then, Miguel appeared. He offered me support, and I accepted." The name of Miguel made Samuel shudder. The man who raised his daughter, who will take on the role of father all these years. The shock of this new reality crushed him. Why doesn't Sophia trust him? Why did she choose to disappear rather than give him the chance to be Livia's father? "You didn't even give me a choice, Sophia," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the floor, unable to look at her at that moment. "I would have done anything for you, for us. But you took that away from me. You took away my chance to be a father, to see my daughter grow up." Sophia, now visibly shaken, swallowed hard. He knew there was not enough justification for the pain he had caused. For years, she tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice, but now, in front of Samuel, that certainty crumbled. "I know I made a mistake, Samuel," she confessed, her voice trembling. "I knew that, one day, this truth would come to light. I just didn't know it would be like this. I didn't want it to be like this. But what would the right way look like?" Samuel felt that any excuse would be insufficient to fill the years he lost. He tried to stem the tide of emotions, knowing there was still one crucial question: Livia. "She doesn't know, does she?" Samuel asked, with a mix of regret and anxiety. "She doesn't know I'm her father." Sophia shook her head, her eyes full of guilt. "No. She doesn't know. For Livia, Miguel has always been the father. And he was a good father, Samuel." The tears returned to her eyes. "He loved her as if she were his daughter. I couldn't destroy it. I never told her, and Miguel never asked." Silence settled between them again. Samuel felt the weight of what was to come. There was no way to avoid it. He needed to tell Livia the truth. But how? And what would this mean for her, who had just lost the man she knew as her father? While Samuel processed everything he had heard, Sophia, on the other hand, looked distressed, as if there was something more she needed to say but was hesitant to share. He realized she was keeping another secret, one that was perhaps as painful as the first. "Sophia, is there anything else you didn't tell me?" he asked, breaking the heavy silence. She took a deep breath, looking at the ground for a few seconds before looking up, full of sadness. "Miguel is sick, Samuel. Very sick." Her voice was almost a whisper. "He has a terminal illness. Doctors said it's a matter of time. There's nothing more they can do for him. The words hit her hard, and Samuel felt the gravity of the situation increase. The man who had raised her daughter was dying, and that was the reason why Sophia and Livia were in the hospital. Everything was starting to fall into place, but in a way that made the situation even more complex. He's at home now, spending the last few days with his family, continued Sophia, with teary eyes. Livia is by his side, trying to be strong, but I know how much this is destroying her. She loves Miguel like the father he was, and I don't know how I'm going to tell her that you're her real father, that her entire life was built on a secret. Samuel felt a knot in his stomach. The revelation was even more painful than he imagined. Livia was in mourning by Miguel, and, at that moment, he felt the depth of the dilemma he faced. How could he enter his daughter's life now, with her facing the loss of the man she knew as a father? Sophia, why are you telling me this now? He asked, his voice low. Why now, after all these years? Sophia looked at him with eyes full of remorse, but also a desperate need for redemption. Because we can no longer escape this truth, Samuel. She replied, her voice wavering. Miguel is dying, and I can't let Livia live the rest of her life without knowing who you are. She needs to know the truth, even if it destroys her for a while. You deserve this chance, and so does she. The weight of the decision hung between them. Samuel knew that, no matter how painful the truth was, it was inevitable. Livia needed to know who her real father was. And as much as it scared him, he was determined to stand up to her, to offer his support, and to somehow build a relationship with the daughter he never knew he had. But how could he tell all this to a young woman who was already dealing with so much grief and suffering? Samuel felt he was entering unknown territory, where the emotional consequences could be devastating for everyone. After his conversation with Sophia, Samuel returned to the hospital with an agitated mind, full of doubts and worries. Every step down the hospital corridor felt heavier. How would he tell Livia the truth? How would she react to discovering that the man she knew as her father was dying and that, in the midst of this tragedy, she had another father she had never heard of? Samuel knew that this revelation had the power to destroy the young woman, but he also knew that he could no longer run away. The news about Miguel's terminal condition brought a new sense of urgency. Sophia was right, Livia needed to know. Samuel knew it would be difficult and painful, but he wanted to be there. He wanted to support Livia, even if, for her, he was just a stranger. That afternoon, as he walked towards Livia's room, Samuel reflected on the life he could have had. What would have been different if you had known that Sophia was pregnant? Would he have abandoned his rising career to be by her side? Or was Sophia right in thinking that he wouldn't have room in his life for a family at that time? They were questions he could never answer with certainty, but now, in front of him, was the chance to resume a relationship that should never have been interrupted. When he entered the room, he found Livia sitting, distracted by the soft light coming through the window. She was visibly stronger, but her eyes reflected the emotional exhaustion of someone who had gone through something much more than a physical recovery. When she noticed Samuel, she smiled slightly, but her expression soon became serious, as if she sensed that something important was about to be said. Samuel approached the bed, sitting on a chair next to it, and took a deep breath before starting to speak. Livia, I need to talk to you about something important, he began, choosing his words carefully. Something that will change a lot. Livia frowned, clearly intrigued by the seriousness in his voice. She nodded slowly, encouraging him to continue. I've been in contact with your mother the last few days. Samuel paused, realizing that the next words would be even more difficult. She told me some things that I think you have a right to know. Livia was now looking at him with a mixture of confusion and apprehension. Her mother's name being mentioned so cautiously made her realize that something important was about to be revealed. But she didn't expect the truth that would come next. Livia. I am your biological father, said Samuel, directly, knowing that there was no other way to alleviate the impact of those words. The shock was immediate. Livia remained motionless, as if her body had been frozen in time. His eyes widened, and the silence that followed the revelation was almost suffocating. She couldn't speak for a few seconds, her hands shaking slightly as she processed what she had just heard. What Samuel had just said seemed impossible, a violent blow to everything she believed to be true. "What?" she whispered, her voice barely coming out. "You, my father." Samuel nodded, feeling a tightness in his chest. He could see the emotional chaos unfolding in Livia's eyes, and all he wanted was to be able to hug and comfort her, but he knew that wouldn't be possible now. Not after such a devastating revelation. "Your mother never told me," he continued, his voice breaking. "I didn't know until now, when I found her. She kept this secret from you and me. I'm sorry, Livia. I would never have left you or your mother if I had known." Livia shook her head, as if trying to deny everything, as if his words could be erased with a simple gesture. She got up from the bed quickly, pacing back and forth, hands on her head, trying to understand how her life could change so drastically in an instant. "That can't be true," she murmured, without looking directly at him. "It can't be." The room seemed to be enclosed in a bubble of tension as Livia struggled to absorb what she had just heard. "Samuel, your biological father? How was this possible?" Throughout her life, Miguel was her father, the man who raised her, who taught her, who was by her side at all important moments. And now, in the most difficult moment, when he was on the verge of death, a new truth emerges that changes everything. Livia stopped abruptly and looked directly at Samuel, her eyes full of tears. "My father. Miguel, he's my father," she said firmly, but her voice was shaking. "He always was. You can't just show up and tell me this was all a lie." Samuel felt the impact of her words, but knew he couldn't back down. He understood her pain, her confusion, her feeling of betrayal. But this truth, cruel as it was, needed to be revealed. He wanted to be honest, wanted her to know he was there, even if it was too late. "I'm not here to take Miguel's place," said Samuel in a soft voice, trying to calm Livia's emotional storm. "He will always be your father, Livia. He created you, loved you. And I respect that. But you also have the right to know who I am. I don't want to erase what you had with him. I just want the chance to be in your life, if you let me." Livia looked at him for a long moment, her eyes red with tears, and then looked away, returning to sit on the bed, visibly shaken. The pain on her face was palpable. She was torn between the love she felt for Miguel and the confusion she felt upon discovering the truth about Samuel. "Why now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "Why wait until now, when I'm losing my father?" The question, which came out as a cry of pain, made Samuel feel a deep tightness in his chest. He didn't have all the answers. All he knew was that fate brought them together at that moment, as devastating as it was. He approached her carefully, sitting next to the bed but keeping enough distance so as not to invade her space. "I wish I had known sooner," said Samuel, his voice hoarse. "But your mother, she hid it from me. She thought she was doing the right thing, but the time is never right for these things. I just want you to know that I'm here, that I'm not going anywhere. And I will respect the time you need." Livia remained silent, tears streaming down her face. Samuel felt a lump in his throat. He knew that as much as he wanted to, he couldn't fix things right away. But he was willing to do whatever it took to be present in his daughter's life, even if the path to doing so was painful. After a few minutes of silence, Livia finally broke the heavy atmosphere. I need time to process this," she said, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what to think, what to feel. I just need some time." Samuel nodded, understanding. He knew that was the only thing he could offer her now, time. Time to process, time to understand, time to forgive. He stood up, walking to the door, and before leaving, he looked back, seeing his daughter, trying to make sense of the chaos her life had become. "I'll be here, Livia. Whenever you're ready," he said, his voice soft. And with those words, Samuel left the room, leaving Livia to process the devastating truth she had just discovered. Now, all he could do was wait. The days that followed were a mixture of silence and pain for Livia. After Samuel's revelation, she isolated herself, trying to find a way to process everything she had discovered. The news that the man he always knew as his father was dying was already devastating. Now, knowing that her real father was the doctor who had treated her, and that he hadn't known of her existence until recently, was something she didn't know how to deal with. Livia spent long hours by Miguel's side, trying to be strong while he became increasingly weak. Each day, his father's face became paler, the life slowly fading away. She knew the end was near, and the weight of the impending loss was almost unbearable. Although Sophia was always there, offering support, Samuel's presence hovered over everything like a shadow. Livia knew she needed to face this new reality, but she didn't know how. She was still in the eye of the emotional storm, torn between mourning Miguel and the shock of discovering a new father. One afternoon, while holding Miguel's hand, she realized how her life would change in a matter of days. His voice was weak, barely audible, but he still tried to talk to her, his eyes full of love and resignation. "I will always be with you, my girl," he whispered, forcing a smile despite the pain he felt. Livia leaned over, letting the tears fall freely. The man who raised her, who was there for every important moment, was leaving. How could she accept another father figure after that? "I love you, Dad," she murmured, holding his hand tightly, as if she could somehow stop him from leaving her. Miguel smiled again, his gaze softening before he closed his eyes. Livia knew that moment was coming, and all she could do was hold his hand and pray for him to have peace. As she said goodbye to Miguel, Livia also knew that there was another emotional battle ahead of her, Samuel. The man who suddenly entered her life like a truth she wasn't ready to accept. She felt like she needed time, but time seemed to be what she lacked most. A few weeks after Miguel's death, the atmosphere in Sophia's house was melancholic. Grief hung in the air, but there was also a sense of closure, as if life was slowly starting to move forward. Samuel had given Livia the space she needed, but he never completely walked away. He knew that to build any kind of relationship, he would need to be patient. And so, he hoped. That afternoon, Livia decided it was time to confront Samuel. She was still torn inside, but she knew she couldn't run away forever. The mourning for Miguel still consumed her, but there was something about Samuel that intrigued her, something that made her want to understand more about him, about the man who should have been in her life from the beginning. She entered the living room, where Samuel was sitting, watching the plants in the garden through the window. Hearing her enter, he turned around, surprised to see her there. Livia looked fragile, but there was a determination in her eyes. "We can talk?" she asked, her voice low but firm. Samuel nodded and gestured for her to sit next to him. The moment seemed full of expectations, as if everything was about to change. He knew that Livia had questions, that there was still a lot to be said, but he didn't want to pressure her. He would wait for her to decide how to proceed. "It's still difficult for me," Livia began, with her eyes downcast, trying to find the right words. "I'm still dealing with the loss of Miguel. He was everything to me." Samuel nodded, his face full of understanding. "I know. And I never wanted to take his place," he said, his voice soft. "Miguel was an incredible father to you. I just hope that someday you can see me in a different light. Not to replace what he was, but to maybe have a new chance to get to know each other." Livia remained silent for a moment, her emotions still conflicted. She knew that Samuel wasn't to blame for anything that happened, but it was still difficult to accept all the change he represented. Still, something inside her told her he deserved this chance. "I don't know how this is going to work," she said finally, looking into Samuel's eyes. But I think we can try. I just need time. I'm still dealing with everything, and I need to understand what it all means. Samuel took a deep breath, feeling soft relief in his words. He knew it would be a long and painful process, but the door was now open, and that was the only thing that mattered to him. I understand. And I'll be here, no rush. As long as you need. I just want you to know that I'm not going anywhere, he said, with a slight smile, full of hope. Livia nodded, still feeling sadness in her heart, but also a lightness when she heard Samuel's words. She stood up and, without saying anything else, hugged him. It was a hesitant gesture at first, but soon the hug intensified. Samuel, taken by surprise, wrapped her in his arms, feeling, for the first time, a genuine connection with the daughter he barely knew. There weren't enough words to express what that moment meant to him. It was the beginning of something new, a new bond, a new chance. When they separated, Livia looked at him, still with tears in her eyes, but with a shy smile on her lips. Thank you for not giving up, she said, her voice still fragile. Samuel smiled back, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. I would never give up on you, Livia, he replied, with conviction. In the months that followed, the relationship between Samuel, Sophia and Livia began to strengthen. It wasn't an easy process, but they were committed to rebuilding what had been lost for so many years. Livia began to know Samuel as the man he was, and not just as a doctor or a stranger who will appear in her life. Samuel, in turn, learned to be patient and give his daughter space to deal with her own emotions. Sophia also participated in this new phase, knowing that past decisions had caused pain, but relieved to see that there was a path to healing. She and Samuel, although they still carried the weight of what they lost, could now see a future where they could be a family, in a way they had never imagined. Livia, still dealing with the loss of Miguel, felt that the love he gave her had prepared her to deal with this new reality. She knew she would never forget him, but also that Samuel was now part of her life. They, like a new family, were ready to move forward, with all the scars of the past, but also with the hope of a lighter future, based on forgiveness, love and truth.